Israel issued a rare warning to its citizens in Greece last week: avoid advertising your nationality in public. The warning came before a nationwide pro-Palestine day of action. These rallies have become a fixture of the Greek summer, as 2026 polling finds 65% of the population oppose a partnership with Israel. Tourists have been targeted. The Israeli cruise ship Crown Iris has been met repeatedly with port protests and been forced to leave under riot police cordon. For decades, Greece was a haven for many Israelis, as a tourist destination, a place to invest, and even a place to move to. That image is now cracking. But at the very same time, Athens is rapidly becoming one of Israel's key partners in the Mediterranean. Earlier this month, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan signed a joint defense agreement in Mecca, framed by many Israeli officials as a threat. Diaspora Affairs Minister Amichai Chikli was among others who said Israel's clear counterpoint was the Hellenic axis. This means Greece and Cyprus. In turn, Greece is buying Israeli weapons on a huge scale. In July, it approved the purchase of a €3.5 billion air defence system, just one part of the biggest military overhaul in modern Greek history, and Israel is at the heart of it. Greek protesters frame this as a moral problem, with taxpayers' money spent on weapons they say were battle-tested in Gaza. But hostilities extend beyond Gaza. Rent has soared, and many Greeks blame Israeli buyers for pricing them out of their own property. Elite strategy is pulling Athens closer to Israel, just as public opinion is pushing it away. Can this alliance survive its own unpopularity? To discuss, I'm joined by two guests: former CIA counterterrorism officer, US Greek citizen, and previous advisor to the Greek government, John Kiriakou, and US Greek journalist and MEE reporter Sean Matthews, whose recent book, The New Byzantines, explores the rise of Greece and return of the Near East. Welcome, both of you, to MEELive. John, I'm going to start with you. You spent years inside the CIA's counterterrorism world. In plain security terms, what is the quid pro quo of the Israel-Greece partnership?
Well, at its most basic level, the Greeks are looking for protection from the Turks. And the Turks and the Israelis have absolutely terrible bilateral relations. In fact, the Israeli defense minister said just 4 weeks ago that Israel's next war would be against Turkey. The Israelis don't believe that even if the Turks invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, an attack on one being an attack on all, that the United States would fight Israel on behalf of Turkey. And so I think they're trying to force everybody's hand here. The truth is that the Greeks are afraid of the Turks. The Greeks don't know where to run, so they run to the Israelis. The Greek people want none of this. And so there's going to have to be a reckoning day, probably sooner rather than later, between the Greek government and the Greek people.
I'm curious just how afraid of Turkey, because Greek defence spending has risen from 5.5 billion in 2019 to over 8 billion a year, with nearly 28 billion euros of modernisation planned by 2036. Is there a real fear of military confrontation in Athens?
There really is. And you hear it all the time. My family happens to be from the glorious island of Rhodes. And I was in Rhodes a couple of 2 months ago visiting family. And I was at our ancestral house. It was built by my great-great-great-grandfather in the village of Yalissos. And I noticed behind my cousin, there was a machine gun against the wall. So I said to my cousin, "Pere Christo, is that a machine gun?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What are you doing with a machine gun?" He said, "All you have to do is look out the door. You can see the mountains of Turkey. We have to protect ourselves somehow." So even down to the most basic level of the average Greek citizen, this isn't just the Greek government screaming this from the rooftops. Every Greek citizen fears Turkey. Now, at the same time, you have Turkish newspapers as recently as 2 days ago publishing maps that show all of the Greek Aegean islands as Turkish. You have the Turkish defense minister threatening an invasion of Greece. You have Turkish fighter jets violating Greek airspace literally every single day. And so the Greeks really are worried. Now, with that said, the Greek people recognize a genocide when they see one, and they don't want to do business with Israel. But the government is forcing it. That's why I say there's going to be a reckoning. There's going to be Greek national elections in 2027, next year, and I think this is going to be a major issue. It's not all economics in Greece anymore.
But if the everyday citizen is afraid of Turkey, as you say, and Athens is sort of partnering with Israel in response to that Turkish threat, doesn't that translate to a popular level? Don't people who fear Turkey accept Israel as a necessary evil? No.
No, because it's my experience that the Greeks believe that the Israelis are taking over. The Israelis asked the Greek government if they could have permission, for example, to purchase an entire island that would just be a Jewish island. And Greek citizens see what's happening in Cyprus, where the Israeli government and Israeli investors are buying entire villages or entire neighborhoods in cities like Paphos and Larnaca. There's an Israeli military base there now. There's a Mossad base in Cyprus where there never was one, at least publicly, ever before. And so it's not just that the Greek government has asked the Israeli government to protect it against Turkey. It's that the Greek government is opening the doors for the Israelis to come and become a permanent presence in Greece. You made a point in your intro that is important and I think bears repeating. Israeli investors are buying vast amounts of real estate to the point where in cities like Athens and Thessaloniki, they've bought up so much of the otherwise affordable real estate to the point where the average working Greek can no longer afford to live in the center of Athens. You can only afford it if you're Israeli, Russian, or Chinese because they're the ones spending the money there. And the Greeks don't want it.
Sean, let's bring you in here because Greece wasn't always in the pro-Israel camp. It voted against the UN partition plan for Palestine in 1947. It was one of the last Western states to formally recognize the state of Israel, which it only did in 1990. What changed, when, and why?
Yeah, well, John and I are kindred spirits because I'm also from the Eastern Aegean. So I'm from Eleusis, which is one of the islands that the Turkish jets buzz. So we are from the lands of New Greece, let's say. Which are kind of the territories that joined Greece last before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But look, I think John really, he was spot on there. And the history is fascinating. You know, one of the things, I mean, you have the images of the protests here in Greece that I want to say is that it's a very bipartisan issue in Greece. I mean, Greece is kind of this country that was defined for many decades by the Civil War, right? This kind of left on right battle. But the sympathy for the Palestinian cause is very much something that kind of connects people, your traditional conservative voter and your voter on the left. For the conservative voters, it's because of the Orthodox Church. Don't forget, there is a very, very deep bond between Palestinian Orthodox Christians and Greek Orthodox Christians. And that is a bond that really transcends centuries. On the left, of course, you had this kind of fervent support for the Palestinians in terms of anti-colonialism, and, you know, kind of the Greeks who took on the cause of Arab nationalism in the 1950s and the 1960s. So this is a bipartisan issue. You know, one of the things that Israel has tried to do throughout Europe and the US, right, is kind of raise the specter of Islamophobia and, you know, kind of this fear of the Muslim world in order to kind of gain allies in the region. And that held for a little bit, I think, in Greece, maybe in 2015, especially with voters on the right. But one thing that we're starting to see broader within Europe in general and in the US, but especially in Greece, is that voters on the right really don't buy it, that, you know, the Israelis are their allies, and that there is a deep sympathy, I think, with the Palestinian people, especially because of the genocide in Gaza. But yeah, that history of support for the Palestinians is there really going back centuries. I mean, again, Palestinians and Greeks lived under the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire even. You had alliances during the time of the Byzantine Empire between Orthodox Christians in Palestine, historic Palestine. So very, very deep roots there. And Greece was the last country at the time to normalize relations with Israel and establish a full diplomatic relationship in 1990. But as John said, right, it's this Turkish relationship, I think this Turkish threat that kind of has propelled this relationship forward. One thing that I should add, though, and again, this kind of goes back to the issue of how populations kind of see Israel and where Israel's public image is. The other reason that the Greeks have really doubled down on this relationship is because they're scared about an American retreat from the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Greek-American lobby is playing a very, very dangerous game, you see in DC, and I know John is very aware of this. You've seen kind of the Greek-American lobby latch on to the Zionist lobby, to AIPAC, and to these groups, because they are betting on an America that's in retreat, trying to stay engaged in the Eastern Mediterranean through its closest ally, which is Israel. So there's another angle to this. There's the Turkish angle, there's the American angle, which is the easiest route to the US and Washington and Congress and the Senate is oftentimes through the Israeli lobby. But again, that is changing, right? We've seen public perceptions of Israel in the US decreasing amongst all voters, especially young Republicans. Obviously, the Democratic Party has moved against them. So there are a myriad of factors here, I think, that the Greeks are betting on or have bet on in the last decade, let's say, regarding Israel and why they feel they need that alliance. But that is changing rapidly.
And let's look at this then from the Israeli perspective. What are the factors driving their friendship with Greece? People point to the Mecca agreement on one hand. There's also the Iran war. Netanyahu talks about this hexagon of alliances: Greece, Cyprus, India, the UAE, Morocco. Many of these sit on maritime choke points. Just talk us through, John, if you will, the Israeli motivations driving this friendship.
This is actually quite a complicated issue. So there are several factors at play. The most obvious one, I think, is the absolutely enormous gas field that Cyprus has discovered off of its southern coast. It's lifting the gas, or in the process of lifting the gas, along with the governments of Greece and Israel. There was talk about involving the Egyptians, and certainly diplomatic discussions have taken place. But it's more than just the gas. It's Turkey, and it's as Sean correctly pointed out, it's the fact that a lot of countries believe that the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East are getting away from the United States. It started with Barack Obama's so-called pivot to Asia. Nobody in the region wanted to see a pivot to Asia. They want American leadership there, and now American leadership is lacking. The Israelis also are very, very happy to establish relations with any country that they think that they can influence or purchase, or who might say a nice thing about what they're doing in Iran or Gaza, or anybody anywhere else, southern Lebanon, Syria. The Israelis were confident, for example, that if they bombed a Turkish base in Syria, but just 20 miles from the Turkish border, that nobody would do anything about it. And they were right. It's the same thing with Iran. Attack Iran for us. Attack, 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 attack. We finally attack. Nobody does anything about it. Sean made another important point, and I see it here in Washington all the time. I spoke at the PSECA conference a couple of months ago. It's the whatever it is, the Greek Cypriot, diaspora organization here in the United States. And the Israeli ambassador was front and center, sitting with the Greek ambassador, the Armenian ambassador. I forget who else was there, the Georgian maybe. But what about the Greek Orthodox Church? Or what about pan-Orthodoxy, right? The way I was raised was to support my Orthodox brethren, no matter where they were in the world, right? Whether they were in Palestine or in Alexandria or Moscow or Kiev or Tbilisi or wherever, because we're all one. We're all one faith until now. And now we're supposed to say, well, those Palestinians, yeah, they're Orthodox, but there's a lot of gas money at play here and bigger international issues. We're just going to walk away from the Palestinians. And I don't think most Greeks are ready to do that, willing to do that.
Was this diaspora event, this was in the US?
Yes, it was in the US, and it came 1 week after the big diaspora event in Cyprus, which I also attended. But the funny thing there is, and again, this comes to Sean's excellent point, the funny thing there is everybody complained about the Israelis. But in Washington, everybody lauded the Israelis. How grateful we were that the Israelis are paying attention to our long-standing issues with Turkey. It's like, no, that's today, but wait until they take over or they own half of your real estate. Then we'll see what they do for you.
Because, right, in Washington, you've long argued that the US is pursuing an Israel-first policy. But you say in Cyprus, the event had a slightly different tone. Would you go so far as to say that Athens is now importing that Israel-first policy, or is that not quite on the same level as the US?
I would say that, yes. I would say that. And I think the only thing that's holding them back from going whole hog is the fact that so many Greeks are in the streets protesting this kind of thing. We're seeing so many news reports, for example, of Israelis not being able to disembark from cruise ships because people are protesting. I was in Athens just until 2 days ago, and I love to stay in this neighborhood called Psiri. It's kind of run down, semi-industrial, but a lot of great cafes and coffee shops and restaurants and things like that. I was with my son, and we were sitting in a cafe, and I'm frequently recognized on the street, and I'm very happy to take selfies with whomever wants one. And one guy said, "I know you. You're the CIA guy," which I get all the time. And I said, "Yes, how are you? Nice to meet you." And he says, "I don't like you at all. You better shut up about Israel." And then, of course, I noticed the Hebrew accent. And I said, "Oh, I'll never, ever stop talking about the genocide that you're committing in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iran. So no, you're not going to silence me."
I want to talk more about that tension on the street right now that is emerging between Greeks and Israelis. Sean, you for your book, you were traveling all around Greece, compiling these conversations with all sorts of demographics. Israel is now warning its citizens to hide their identity. How real is that tension on the ground? Is it anger at a government, or is it anger at Israelis themselves?
You know, Greeks face a double-edged sword, Mathilda, because the Greek economy, it's really this hot, Greece had this horrible financial crisis. It's still emerging out of the financial crisis. And if you come to Athens or Thessaloniki or the islands, what you see is, and I say in the book, The New Byzantines, you see kind of this entropole, this booming kind of Eastern Mediterranean city, right? Gourmet restaurants, you hear a lot of Lebanese, snappy Lebanese Arabic, you hear a lot of Egyptian Arabic on the street, you hear Hebrew. It's attracting a lot of hot foreign money. So the Greeks, on one hand, they have kind of courted the Israelis for investment, right? Especially real estate investment. And I'm not talking about big businessmen, I'm talking about people selling maybe their grandparents' apartment, right? Or their uncle's house, and they need a buyer, and the only one who can buy that is an Israeli. So I think what we saw in the relationship, especially in 2015, 2016, 2017, when really it was unclear whether Greece would leave the euro or not, and there was a deep, deep economic uncertainty, the Greeks really welcomed the Israelis because they had no one else to sell to, basically. And the Israelis swooped in, and they really came in. Now what we're seeing is that investment, as John had said, so eloquently in the beginning, that investment has compounded in extraordinary cost of living crisis for ordinary Greeks, in which you have apartments in Athens that are priced higher than apartments in the U.S. And there's a massive salary differential. I mean, it's impossible to understate or to overstate, that is, how expensive Athens is. And how expensive real estate in cities like Thessaloniki and Athens city center are. And a lot of that is because of Israeli investment. So there's a personal story here for sure, an economic story here that people are feeling. I think also, again, the genocide in Gaza has been covered a lot in Greek media, to its credit. People see it on Instagram, they listen to Middle East Eye, they see the content, they are aware of the reality of the genocide in Gaza. And remember, look, this is a very small region, the Eastern Mediterranean. For somebody in Chicago, maybe Gaza feels 1,000 miles away, because it kind of is. But if you're in Athens, Palestine is a 2-hour flight. Egypt is a 2-hour flight. It's very, very close. It's easier to get to Gaza from Athens than it is to go from New York City to Washington, D.C., to be quite honest with you. If there was a direct connection, it's nothing. So I think that tangible feeling is very much there. And the tension is on the street, right? Because of this, you have the genocide, you have the conflict, and then you have kind of the economic crisis. One other thing that I think is important, that we should kind of think about looking forward here, is that 2015, 2016, when the Greeks wanted a partner, they went to the Israelis, and this does feed back into the popular opinion about Israel today. The Israelis seemed like a steady hand, maybe, to many Greeks, I think, at the time, right? Remember, this was before the Iran war. It was before the genocide. Israel looked very powerful. In 2020, what did we have? We had the Abraham Accords agreements. So the Israelis went to the Emiratis. Greece desperately wants Gulf money from all the Gulf states. They want Qatari money. They want Emirati money. They want Saudi money. They want to partner with all these Gulf states. So 2016 through 2020, Israel kind of looked like, if you're Greece and you're thinking mercurially, the country to bet on in order to get these good ties. Now what have we seen? We've seen a failing war in Iran. We've seen Saudi Arabia distance itself from Israel. We've seen Qatar obviously has really stood by the Palestinian people. The only ally that Israel really has in the Gulf is the UAE, one country, basically. Every other country has turned on the Israelis. Even now, the Egyptians, right? And this is very important. Greece and Egypt have very historic ties. I'm here in Athens. I know John comes to Athens a lot. The Egyptian embassy in Athens is literally a stone's throw from the Parliament building. That's a historic embassy that goes back to the fact that when Greece was proclaimed in the 19th century, the Egyptians were one of the first country under Muhammad Ali Pasha to recognize the Greeks. And there are deep trade ties between them. So, the historic ties between Greece and Egypt, there were hundreds of thousands of Greeks who lived in Egypt. The ties between Greece and Egypt have always been very good, okay? And the Greeks have always kind of courted the Egyptians in their competition with the Turks. Today, what we're seeing is Egypt moving closer to Turkey because of its concerns about a militaristic and expansionist Israel. So, in the Greek street, Israel no longer looks like the steady-handed ally that can help. It looks like a potential threat that is pulling your allies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or potential allies, away from you. So I think all these factors are combining, and Greeks are getting a second opinion of Israel.
I suppose these strands sort of come together as well, because if economically there's a cost of living crisis, there's crumbling public services in a lot of areas in Greece, then you have the genocide in Gaza, and you have this crumbling image of Israel as a reliable partner. If you see your government spending loads on Israeli arms and techs and defence deals, while you think it's not spending enough on, firefighting, hospitals, pensions, those tensions sort of come together in that way as well. John, I'm really curious about this property issue. I want to ask a little bit more about it, because very often when we have tensions around migration and tensions around the housing crisis, they really intersect. And often you'll see immigrants being sort of scapegoated or becoming a really easy excuse for why the housing sector is in crisis. Greece also is on the front line of Europe. The borders are hardening and attitudes towards migration are hardening with it. Does this attitude towards Israeli migration and Israeli property purchasing, is it really distinct from the overall sort of anti-migrant sentiment?
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, it is different, because it's at a different economic level. I'll tell you the honest to God's truth, and Sean and I talked about this last time we got together for coffee. I'm looking to buy a place in Athens right now. And when I started looking about 2 years ago, things were affordable in the center of Athens, the historic center, the area essentially around the Acropolis, and then stretching north about a mile, let's say, 1.5 kilometers. And now it's not affordable. It's because so many Israeli investors have come in and bought up the properties in the historic center. They're not out where the refugees are. They're not in Omonia Square, which is, a little bit seedy when the sun goes down, where there are a lot of refugees, especially Arab and South Asian refugees. They're in the very center, the very heart of touristic Athens. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I like to stay in the neighborhood of CD. So I was in CD, I'm going to say in March, and it was a building with 6 floors, 2 apartments on each floor. And it turned out that I was the only person in the building for the week that I was there. And there was a cleaning lady that came in, and I said, it's like a ghost town in this building. What's going on? And she said, Israelis bought all the apartments and made them all Airbnb. The problem, though, is while those buildings are sitting empty, Greeks cannot afford to live in their own capital, because all of this outside money has come in and pushed prices higher.
We have the same problem in London, not specifically with Israeli purchasing, but vacant houses, occupying the centre of the city. And really interestingly, there was a poll, YouGov poll in the UK here, on attitudes towards migration. It found that while in general attitudes towards migration have fallen, they have fallen above all for 2 populations. One is Russian and the other is Israeli. Russian is probably one of the key buyers in this property story, but the connection between them are both, of course, these invasions that people have been seeing unfold on the news. And I think that was an interesting revelation about what drives these migration debates, because it's not so much in the media when you talk about migration.
No. And there are famous stories about entire blocks in Mayfair and Knightsbridge where there are buildings without a single light on at night, because these units are all owned by Russian, Chinese, Israeli, Qatari investors, and there's nobody living in these buildings, not on a permanent basis.
Now
Same thing in Athens now.
Yeah. Now, just to close this conversation, I'm going to ask you each a final question. Sean, with your book, The New Byzantines, the framing, right, is that today is a period of rejuvenation for Greece in terms of its global and its regional relevance. But how key is Israel to that growing relevance? Does Greece retain its growing relevance, as you say, at the intersection between the West and the Middle East without this alliance with Israel?
No, Greece very much does. And the reason Israel wants Greece is because of its geography, because the borders, although they're hardening and attitudes toward immigration are hardening in Europe, the wider trend is the borders are shrinking. And the space between Europe and the Middle East is a lot smaller than it's ever been, probably in the last 200 years. And Greece has a very, very good geography. That's why so many investors are coming here, to be quite honest with you, because it's 2 or 3 hours from everywhere in the world, basically. And it has a very, very envious geography. The islands of Crete, look at where the U.S. military is based. In Crete, look at Alexandroupoli, the base in northeastern Greece, which the U.S. has used to supply Ukraine with arms. Greece's geography is extremely important. And it's important for any country, for the Gulf states, for Egypt, even for Turkey, honestly. The cooperation that if Greece and Turkey can have a solid economic cooperation, and we see some of this on the Eastern Aegean islands, there's lots of win-win solutions for both countries there. So Greece very, very much is still relevant to all these countries, and more important than ever, because that space between Europe and the Middle East is shrinking, and we're kind of seeing this return to an Eastern Mediterranean region, in part, honestly, because of the collapse of U.S. power in the region. That's the greatest irony.
And John, you say that if the government of Greece pushes forwards with its alliance with Israel, it will face a reckoning of public opinion. If you were advising the Greek government how to navigate this, the threat of Turkey, but the unpopularity of Israel, what would you advise the government?
I think the government should be forceful in its public statements in support of human rights and civil liberties. And they should not pretend that none of these things are being violated in Palestine. I think, look, the Greek government, as Sean said, the Greek government historically had very close, long-term relations with the Palestinians and with the Egyptians as well. My own grandfather's brother spent 20 years in Alexandria before emigrating to the United States. So I think that the Greeks can be honest about this long history of support for the Arab people of the region. The Greeks can be the honest broker in this bilateral or trilateral relationship. The Greeks can still seek, Israeli assistance against Turkey, whether it's, actual military assistance or it's a friendly statement at the United Nations. But the Greeks should not just jump into bed with the Israelis blindly and hope for the best. They teach you in business school, hope is not a strategy. And this is a complicated issue that the Greeks are not taking terribly seriously.
This has been a highly enlightening conversation. John Kiriakou, Sean Matthews, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.